We have 3 talks in the second section. And our first talk is going to be given by Professor Alfred Kobsa, and he's going to be talking about privacy concerns for software.
Thank you very much. All of you probably were in a situation like this. You want to install a new app, Android battery, and the system asks you, do you want to install this app? This app will edit your SMS, read contact data, wants full internet access, it will modify, delete your SD card. And your choice is yes or no. So take it or leave it. So you know what I mean. By the way, this is a Trojan. It will steal your SMSs and send it to some server for some obscure reason. You probably also know that increasingly, specifically for Android, Windows Phone, but in the future also probably for iOS, people will have more nuanced control over permissions they give. So you see here, you can give permissions for location, contacts, modify contracts for this Facebook app. And you even get information why, or supposed to get information, why the app needs those permissions. And this is clearly transparency. Users have a choice, they have control. Facebook, for many years, Facebook was pretty much under attack for not giving people control over privacy. Now they have about 170 privacy settings like this. You can really fine-tune what you want to disclose to, under what circumstances. And here industry seems to be ahead of regulation. There is a US Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights floating around from the White House that demands individual control for privacy decisions, clear and simple choices, and transparency. And industry is now being asked to come up with principles and with a code of conduct that follows these principles. And the European Union, of course, has had privacy legislations for many years. And here you see an excerpt of the new proposed General Data Protection Regulation. And also this regulation contains notions like consent and providing information to users that is relevant for privacy choices. So it looks like this is great, and if you ask people themselves whom they trust most in protecting their privacy, guess what the answer is? Is it the government? Is it the industry? No, people say we ourselves can protect our privacy best. And finally, also privacy researchers for many years have demanded from industry to give people more choices, finer grained choices, and to be more transparent. But I didn't put this on the slide. Now everything looks like perfect, but there are some problems. First, as you have guessed when I said Facebook gives you 170 privacy choices, this can become unwieldy. And there is now all sorts of research, first comments from the New York Times that calls those privacy options bewildering, a tangle of options, labyrinthian, US Consumer Magazine. And of course, researchers have already found out that people are extremely bad at understanding these privacy options and get it wrong much of the time. So people cannot handle such a high amount of privacy decisions simply from the point of unwieldiness. Unfortunately, there's also a deeper underlying problem. Giving people privacy choices assumes that people are kind of rational decision makers. And we know, have been knowing for many years that this is not the case. People are actually bad decision makers, specifically if uncertainty is involved, and even more so if the future is involved. And there have been many studies that show that people don't make good privacy decisions, rational privacy decisions, but simply make decisions in some way, take shortcuts or just pick something. And researchers have found, for instance, that if you tell people what other people choose, they will tend to choose the same. If you ask people very sensitive questions first, they will tend to answer more questions than if you start out with easy questions. So if you want to know the secrets of your spouse, ask with the hard questions first. If you inform people about privacy implications, this will raise privacy fears, and people will typically avoid a decision or choose a very conservative option, unnecessarily conservative option. If you give people information about privacy, it depends very much on the position and workflow, whether people will take it into account or completely ignore it. If you give people information about privacy in a professionally designed user interface, people will be more scared than if it's a completely unprofessional design. If you give people a privacy link, people will ignore the privacy link and continue disclosing data. If you show people an avatar like this, where the eyeballs follow your cursor, people will suddenly disclose less. Might get scared or whatever. Yeah? So objective information is ignored, eyeballs count. If you give people control, as we saw in the previous examples, actually people get overconfident and tend to disclose more than what might be good for them. Yeah, so there's all sorts of biases, strange behavior that people have in privacy decision making. And for this reason, researchers who are always critical kind of proclaim, to some extent, the death of transparency and control. You say that transparency and choice has failed, does not provide people with meaningful choices, it's a red herring, even it's harmful, it's a slight of privacy. And specifically, if we look a little bit in the future, into ubiquitous computing, where we have sensors that track us all the time, and big data that is being collected about us, then we cannot make privacy decisions each and every time for each and every little piece of information. So big data is the death knell for informed consent. So should we give up individuals' involvement in privacy decisions? Should we leave everything, say, to industry or to the government? And of course, as you can get, the answer is there might be still hope. And I characterize the direction. If we reorient transparency and control onto important privacy decisions only, so not the 170 options, but rather 5, maximum 10, and also onto people who want to self-manage their privacy. The vast majority doesn't really want. And have suitable personalized privacy defaults for all remaining cases, then this would be feasible and manageable still. Now, of course, the proposed solution is prediction. We try to predict what privacy choices people make. Sounds strange. Once we make a prediction, we set the preferences according to the prediction. It's default preferences, so people can override the defaults. We know, however, that people will hardly ever look into the default settings. But if they do, we take a note of this, and over time we'll possibly revise, optimize our prediction algorithm. Now you say, privacy decisions are deeply personal. We won't be able to predict them. I show you 3 experiments that show that this might be possible. It's all experiments where people were asked to disclose various personal data, or whether or not they would disclose this personal data. And people's decision was noted down. And then we performed a factor analysis to find types of data for which each individual user exhibited similar disclosure behavior. So they tended to disclose all of these pieces of data within the type, or rather not to disclose these pieces of data. And then we performed a cluster analysis to find subgroups of users who exhibited similar disclosure behavior. If privacy decisions are truly personal, this would not be possible. But we found interesting things. In the first experiment, we found that people, each individual, had similar disclosure behavior with regard to demographic data, so either they tended to disclose those or not, and context data, where context refers to computer usage. So like, may we track your location? May we check what SMS you're sending? So what people are doing with computers. So we found these 2 different types of data, that the people have similar disclosure behavior. And we found that there are 4 different clusters of people. One kind of people, it's the green cluster, tends to disclose a large amount of information, roughly 1 standard deviation more than the average, both context and demographic data. The red cluster here does the opposite, discloses little information. Here's a small purple cluster that discloses average information. And here an interesting cluster, those are people who disclose lots of demographic data about themselves, but very few context data. Now, if we would be able, here comes a new user, if we would be able to tell to which privacy group this user belongs, we would be able to make prediction about what the user is going to disclose and set privacy preferences accordingly. Are we able to do that? Well, we also looked at other characteristics of people and found that the amount of mobile internet usage is very well correlated with group membership. If for people who have a high amount of mobile internet usage, this green group here, amount of disclosure is high. If you have little internet usage, mobile internet usage, you are more likely to belong to the low disclosure group, and those are somewhere in between. So this gives a hint that there might be objectively determinable characteristics that are predictors for group membership. We ran a second study where we asked people how likely they are to disclose certain data to e-tailers. And we found that people had similar disclosure intentions with regard to health data, interests, work-related data, and contact data, address, email, phone number. And again, we did a cluster analysis and found 4 clusters with different disclosure behaviors. The green cluster here discloses a lot of health data, interest, work-related data, but little contact data, whereas the red cluster is just the opposite, little health, interests, work, but quite a bit of contact data. And the others are in between. And here we found that age is quite well related to group membership. If you're older, meaning here 40 or so, you're more likely to belong to this blue cluster, whereas if you're more in your upper 20s, you're more likely to belong to this cluster here. So here age could be used as a tentative predictor for group membership here, and this could be used as prediction for your privacy preferences. And now I asked a former PhD student of mine who had done a study on people's willingness to disclose all sorts of data on Facebook to the whole world to send us the data, and we did the same thing and found that people had similar disclosure behavior with regard to actions on their Facebook wall, location data, contact data, and interests. So those were good clusters. And then we found 5 different clusters with different disclosure behavior. Like for instance, this blue cluster here, people who belong to this cluster tend to disclose interest data very frequently, contact data very little, location data, and also actions on the wall. And the purple cluster here is very similar, except those members do not disclose Facebook wall actions for whatever reason. Here we had no data on objective characteristics of people, but we had a couple of answers to attitudinal questions, and we found that people's trust in Facebook might be a predictor. People who distrust Facebook very little disclose little, which makes sense. People who say, yes, Facebook must ask for my permission if they change their privacy policy, tended to be in these clusters, whereas people who said, no, that's not necessary, tended to be in this green cluster, and they disclose very much. So here it's a little bit weaker, the evidence, but still there are some certain predictors that we might look at. All right, what does this mean for practice? Currently, obviously, industry is in the process of giving people more and more privacy choices, but based on this research and research of others, that's not enough because people cannot take advantage of these privacy choices. They cannot make good privacy decisions. It's too many, and they are not rational decision makers. So we have to help them, and the direction I want to propose is as part of the usability studies, user needs analysis that many companies do anyways before launching a product, also look at privacy issues. Try to identify different privacy groups with different privacy preferences and also characteristics of these people. And then after deployment, if a new user comes, assign this user to one or possibly more of these privacy groups, predict privacy preferences, and set personalist privacy defaults. And then look at how many people correct the defaults, revise the algorithm, and after a couple of years, like 2 or 3 years, do the whole user studies again, because people change, society changes, etc. Yeah, so now this is the HCI-ish approach. If your company name happens to be Google, then you don't like HCI approach, user needs analysis, but rather you throw something out, and you have machine learning that kind of does all this on the fly. So you form groups and adjust to these groups on the fly. And that's also possible, probably. Actually, I tried to work on this. And finally, privacy regulation also needs to take these results into account. So demanding transparency control is good, but it should also contain provisions that kind of forces industry to go a step further, do privacy studies, talk with each other in a pre-competitive manner. In the field of HCI, companies have their usability conferences, exchange information, and the same could happen in the area of privacy. And then follow best practices, come up with gold standards. Thank you very much.
We have time for a couple questions.
Do your groups correlate at all with the traditional 3 privacy types?
We find those privacy types occasionally. like if I have a little bit more time, one could see this, this, and this here,
Yeah.
but we find additional stuff.
Yeah, that's what I was noticing.
Yeah. So yeah. Also, if you look carefully in the other graphs, you may be able to see those three groups, but it's the granularity is low. We must come up with finer distinctions, and we can come up with finer distinctions.
I have a question. So I've noticed recently a few apps on my phone, the developers seem to be getting smarter about when they prompt you to access things like contacts and things like that. They seem to have engineered it to try to find like frustrating moments where you're like, I just need the next, and then you'll like click anything on the make the dialogue go away. Doesn't work like this that helps us understand what people want or whatever, doesn't it rely upon the actual developers, the organizations to actually want to like do the right thing? Because otherwise they could use this for black hat. I mean, kind of, it's white hat versus black hat all over again.
Mm-hmm.
New
Yeah.
domain.
No, it's definitely the case that you can manipulate people in the area of privacy. As a matter of fact, I have to confess, we conduct our own experiments where we try to change things in order to increase people's disclosure or in order to lower people's disclosure. So one can do that. As always, it's better if this knowledge is public so that it can be recognized if it's being abused by industry. There are, I mean, we can slowly then come up with design standards, design templates of how it should be done. This already exists in the area of web interfaces, and I can imagine templates very well for privacy interactions if needed.
Thank you. Let's thank our speaker.